Why would a lady this beautiful be left unchaperoned? The words reached Eleanor Hartley before she fully registered the presence behind her. They were spoken with calm confidence, neither mocking nor crude, yet they stirred something sharp and uneasy in her chest. She paused mid-step on the narrow gravel path, her gloved hand tightening around the ribbon of her bonnet as she slowly turned. The man stood a few feet away, tall and composed, dressed in a dark riding coat that bore the marks of long travel. A black horse waited patiently behind him, reins loose, its breath forming faint clouds in the cool afternoon air. His expression was unreadable, yet his eyes held an intensity that made Eleanor instinctively straighten her posture. "I beg your pardon, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of her heartbeat. "You startled me." "That was not my intention," he replied, inclining his head slightly. "But the road ahead is lonely, and I could not help but wonder why a lady would be walking it alone." Eleanor measured him carefully, recalling every warning her aunt had ever given her about strangers and appearances. Yet something about him felt restrained, observant, not the reckless boldness she had come to fear. "I'm quite capable of walking on my own," she said, "and I'm not far from home." His lips curved into the faintest smile. Independence is admirable. Still, the world is not always kind to those who rely on it too much. She bristled. Nor is it kind to those who assume weakness where there is none. For a moment, he studied her, as though reassessing a puzzle he had not expected to encounter. "You are right," he said at last. "Forgive my presumption." Eleanor nodded once, prepared to continue on her way, but his next words stopped her again. "Eleanor Hartley." Her breath caught. "Why do you know my name?" "I know many things," he answered calmly. "Some by chance, some by necessity." Her instincts screamed caution. She took a step back. "Then perhaps you should also know that this conversation is at an end." "Perhaps," he agreed. "But if I let you walk away without warning, I would regret it." "Warning me of what?" she demanded. He glanced toward the tree line that bordered the path, where shadows had begun to stretch as the sun dipped lower. "There are men watching this road. Not all travelers mean well." Eleanor followed his gaze, unease settling deep in her stomach. She had sensed it too, the feeling of being observed, dismissed as imagination until now. "You could be one of them," she said quietly. "If I were," he replied, "you would not be standing here arguing." Silence fell between them, heavy and uncertain. Eleanor weighed her choices quickly. Pride urged her forward alone. Reason whispered caution. "What do you suggest?" she asked. He gestured toward his horse. "Allow me to escort you as far as the bend. No further. After that, I will leave you. And if I refuse, then I will ride ahead and make certain the road is clear," he said. "Either way, you will not be unprotected." She studied him again, searching for deception. Instead, she found restraint. Reluctant trust flickered within her. "Very well," she said, "but only to the bend." He offered his arm, which she hesitated before taking. His sleeve was warm beneath her fingers, his presence steady as they began to walk together. They moved in silence for several moments, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet filling the space between them. "You did not answer my question," she said at last. "Which one?" "Why you knew my name." He exhaled slowly. "Because your family's affairs are spoken of more than you realize." Eleanor stiffened. "My family's affairs are private." "Not to everyone," he said. "Your father's debts, your aunt's ambitions, your sudden importance." She stopped walking. "Importance?" He turned to face her fully now. "You are at the center of negotiations that could alter more than your future." Her pulse quickened. "You speak in riddles." "Because clarity would place you in danger," he said simply. Anger flared. "You presumed far too much authority over my understanding." "Then allow me to correct that," he said. "My name is Julian Ashford, and I am not your enemy." She searched his face, noting the sincerity in his eyes, the tension he seemed to carry as though constantly on guard. "And what are you to me?" she asked. "For now," he said, "a witness to your courage. And perhaps, if fate insists, something more." They resumed walking, but Eleanor's thoughts raced ahead. Her life, once defined by predictable days and quiet duties, suddenly felt like a fragile illusion. As they reached a bend in the road, Julian slowed. "This is where I leave you," he said. "You promised to ensure the road was clear," she reminded him. "And I will," he said, mounting his horse. "Wait here until I signal." Before she could object, he rode ahead, disappearing briefly around the curve. Eleanor stood alone, heart pounding, every sound amplified. Moments later, Julian returned, his expression grim. "You were right to be cautious," he said. "There were men waiting. They have gone for now." A chill ran through her. "Who are they?" "Men who see value where they should see choice," he replied. "You must be careful." She met his gaze, fear and resolve colliding within her. "I will not be controlled." "I know," he said softly. "That is why they are interested in you." He tipped his hat and turned his horse once more. "Julian," she called after him. "Will I see you again?" He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "If destiny has any sense at all," he said, "this was only the beginning." As he rode away, Eleanor realized something had shifted irrevocably. The quiet path she had walked countless times no longer led simply home. It led forward into uncertainty, danger, and a future she had never imagined, but one she now knew she would face head-on. Eleanor did not look back as she continued down the road, but she felt the absence of Julian Ashford like a sudden drop in temperature. The space he had occupied moments earlier seemed charged, as though the air itself remembered him. Each step toward home felt heavier, her thoughts tangled with his warnings and the unsettling certainty that her world was no longer as small or as safe as she had believed. When Hartley House finally came into view, its pale stone walls glowing softly in the fading light, Eleanor released a breath she did not realize she had been holding. The familiar sight should have comforted her, yet unease clung stubbornly to her senses. She glanced once more at the road behind her before pushing open the gate. Inside, the house hummed with its usual restrained order. A maid passed her in the corridor with a polite nod, and somewhere upstairs, a door closed softly. Everything appeared unchanged, and yet Eleanor felt profoundly altered. Her Aunt Margaret was waiting in the drawing room. "You are late," Aunt Margaret said without looking up from her embroidery. Her tone was mild, but Eleanor recognized the calculation beneath it. "I trust your walk was uneventful." Eleanor removed her gloves carefully, choosing her words. "I encountered a rider on the road." Aunt Margaret's hand paused for a fraction of a second. "A rider?" "Yes." And her aunt's gaze finally lifted, sharp and assessing. "And nothing," Eleanor replied. "He escorted me briefly, then left." Silence stretched between them. Aunt Margaret set aside her embroidery with deliberate calm. "You must not encourage such encounters." "I did not encourage it," Eleanor said, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. "He approached me." "That is precisely the danger," her aunt replied coolly. "People approach when they believe opportunity presents itself." Eleanor felt a flicker of anger. "Am I an opportunity now?" Aunt Margaret's lips thinned. "You are a responsibility." Eleanor bit back the retort that rose to her tongue. Responsibility. The word echoed painfully. Always spoken as though it were a virtue, never a burden imposed without consent. "I am tired," Eleanor said instead. "May I be excused?" Her aunt studied her a moment longer. "Very well, but tomorrow we will speak further." Eleanor inclined her head and left the room, her heart pounding faster with every step toward the staircase. Julian's words returned unbidden. "Your sudden importance." In her bedroom, she lit a single lamp and sank onto the edge of the bed. The room was familiar, too familiar. The pale curtains, the neatly arranged books, the faint scent of lavender. Had this always been a cage she simply had not noticed? A soft knock sounded at the door. "Come in," she called. Her cousin Thomas entered, his expression unusually serious. "Aunt Margaret said you were out walking alone." "I was," Eleanor replied. "That was unwise," he said quietly. She looked up at him sharply. "You sound just like her." Thomas hesitated, then closed the door behind him. "There are things you don't know." "Then tell me," Eleanor said, rising to her feet. "Everyone seems determined to speak around me instead." Thomas exhaled slowly. Our family is not as secure as you believe. Your father left debts, significant ones. I know that, Eleanor said. But that was years ago. Yes, Thomas said, and they're being called in. A chill spread through her. By whom? By men who prefer leverage to patience, he replied. And you, Eleanor, are leverage. Her breath caught. Julian's warning took on sharper meaning. What does that mean? Thomas looked away. Marriage negotiations. Arrangements. Solutions. Without my consent, Eleanor said. With your compliance, Thomas corrected gently. Aunt Margaret believes it is the only way. Eleanor laughed softly, the sound brittle. She believes obedience will save us. She believes survival matters more than choice, he said. Eleanor turned toward the window, staring out into the darkened garden. And what do you believe? Thomas was silent for a long moment. I believe you deserve the truth, he said at last, which is more than most are willing to give you. She nodded slowly. Thank you. After he left, Eleanor remained awake long into the night, replaying every word spoken that day. The stranger on the road was no longer merely a curiosity. He was a thread woven into a far larger design. The following morning brought no peace. Breakfast was a stiff affair, heavy with unspoken tension. Aunt Margaret announced that guests would be arriving within the week, her meaning unmistakable. Later that afternoon, Eleanor slipped out into the garden, seeking solitude among the winter bare trees. She barely had time to breathe before a familiar voice reached her. You shouldn't be alone. She turned sharply. Julian stood near the iron gate, dressed more simply than before, yet no less imposing. His presence sent a strange mix of relief and alarm through her. You followed me, she said. I protected you, he replied. There is a difference. You said you were not my enemy, Eleanor said. Yet you appear where you are not invited. His gaze softened. And you listen, despite knowing you should not. She folded her arms. You said there were men interested in me. Now I know why. Then you know time is not on your side, Julian said. What do you want from me? She demanded. To offer you a choice, he replied. Her heart raced. What choice? To trust me, he said, or to let others decide your future. She studied him, searching for manipulation, ambition, threat. Instead, she saw urgency and restraint. And what happens if I trust you? She asked. Then we move carefully, he said, quietly, and not alone. Eleanor thought of her aunt's measured control, of negotiations conducted as though she were an object. Then she thought of the road, the warning, the way Julian had turned back to face danger without hesitation. I will not be traded, she said. Julian inclined his head. Then you must be willing to fight the terms. A spark ignited within her, fear tempered by resolve. Tell me everything, she said. He met her gaze steadily. I will. But once I begin, there is no returning to ignorance. Eleanor did not hesitate. Then begin. As he spoke, the world she had known fractured further, revealing the hidden machinery beneath polite society. Alliances, debts, influence. And at the center of it all, her name. By the time he finished, the sun was sinking low once more. You still have time, Julian said quietly. But not much. Eleanor lifted her chin. Then I will not waste it. Somewhere beyond the garden walls, the future waited, dangerous, uncertain, and undeniably hers. The truth settled over Eleanor like a slow-burning fire. Julian's words echoed in her mind long after he had slipped away through the garden gate, leaving behind silence thick with consequence. She stood motionless for several minutes, her hands clenched at her sides, staring at the place where he had vanished, as though willing him to return and confirm that what she had heard was real. That night, sleep refused her entirely. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep, every shadow on the wall like a watcher. She had lived in Hartley House for years without fear, yet now it felt exposed, vulnerable, as though its walls were made of glass rather than stone. For the first time, she understood what Julian had meant when he spoke of leverage. She was not merely living her life here. She was being positioned. Morning arrived pale and cold. Eleanor dressed with deliberate care, choosing a simple gown that allowed freedom of movement rather than ornament. The choice felt symbolic, though she could not have explained why. When she descended the stairs, Aunt Margaret was already seated at the breakfast table, composed as ever. "You look tired," her aunt observed. "I did not sleep well," Eleanor replied. "That is to be expected," Aunt Margaret said. "Change often brings discomfort." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Does it?" "Yes," her aunt said smoothly, "especially when one resists it." Eleanor said nothing, but something inside her hardened. Resistance, she realized, was precisely what frightened her aunt. Later that morning, visitors were announced. 3 men arrived in succession, each impeccably dressed, each bearing polite smiles and sharp eyes. Eleanor recognized the performance instantly. They were not here to see her. They were here to assess her, to measure her value, her obedience, her silence. She endured their questions with careful restraint. Yes, she enjoyed reading. Yes, she preferred the countryside. Yes, she believed family duty was important. Each answer was true enough to satisfy them, yet guarded enough to reveal nothing. When the final guest departed, Eleanor felt wrung dry. "You conducted yourself well," Aunt Margaret said approvingly. "I was evaluated," Eleanor replied coolly. Her aunt's expression did not change. "You were considered." Eleanor stood. "By men who see me as a solution." Aunt Margaret's voice sharpened. "By men who can save this family." "At the cost of my freedom," Eleanor said. Her aunt rose as well, her composure cracking just enough to reveal steel beneath. "Freedom is a luxury, Eleanor. One not everyone can afford." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Then perhaps it is time someone stopped pretending I owe mine to strangers." For the first time, Aunt Margaret looked unsettled. That afternoon, Eleanor slipped away under the pretense of a short walk. Her heart raced as she passed through the familiar gate and followed the path that led beyond the estate. She did not know if Julian would be there, but she knew she could not remain still. He was waiting, leaning against a tree at the edge of the road. Julian straightened as she approached, his expression unreadable. "You came alone," he said. "I needed answers," Eleanor replied. "You have them," he said. "You simply don't like what they require." She stopped in front of him. "You said there were men watching me. Are they the same men who visited my house this morning?" "Yes," Julian said, "and others." Her breath caught. "How many?" "Enough," he replied, "which is why we must move carefully." "We?" Eleanor asked. He met her gaze. "If you wish." She hesitated only a moment. "I do." Julian nodded once. "Then you must understand something. The choices ahead of you will not be clean. You may lose people. You may lose comfort. You may lose the life you recognize." Eleanor thought of the drawing room, the polite smiles, the quiet suffocation. "I have already lost it," she said. A flicker of approval crossed his face. "Good." They walked together along the road, not touching, yet aware of each other in a way Eleanor had never experienced before. Julian spoke in low tones, explaining alliances and interests, debts disguised as favors, marriages treated as contracts. "You are valuable because you are seen as compliant," he said. "The moment that perception changes, their approach will too." "Then I must change it," Eleanor said. "Gradually," Julian corrected. "Too fast and they will act." She frowned. "Act how?" "Forcefully," he replied. A shiver ran through her. "And you?" "I interfere," he said simply. She studied him. "Why?" Julian stopped walking. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "Because I have seen what happens when people are cornered and told it is for their own good." "That is not an answer," Eleanor said. "Is the only honest one I have," he replied. Before she could press him further, the sound of hooves reached them. Julian stiffened instantly, his hand lifting in warning. They stepped off the road just as a rider passed, his gaze lingering too long on the empty path. "They are already watching," Eleanor whispered. "Yes," Julian said. "And now, so are we." He led her to a small clearing hidden from the road, where the trees grew thick and close. "If you choose this path," he said, "you will need allies." "I have none," Eleanor said. "You have me," Julian replied. "For now." She looked at him steadily. "And later?" "That depends on you," he said. Silence stretched between them, charged and fragile. I will not run, Eleanor said at last. I will not disappear or be hidden away. Julian nodded. Good, because disappearance would confirm their power. Then what do I do? You learn, he said. You listen. You allow them to believe you're still undecided. Eleanor's jaw tightened. You want me to pretend? I want you to survive, he said. Pretending is a small price. She considered this. And if they push, they will, Julian said. That is inevitable. Eleanor lifted her chin. Then I will be ready. For the first time, Julian smiled fully. Not with charm, but with something like respect. You already are. As dusk crept in, they parted ways once more, neither willing to linger too long. Eleanor returned home with a new awareness. Every glance from a servant suddenly weighted with possibility. That night, a letter was slipped beneath her door. She recognized the seal immediately. A formal invitation, a dinner, a decision. Eleanor held the letter tightly, her pulse steady despite the threat it represented. She thought of the road, of Julian's warning, of the fire now burning quietly within her. They believe they are choosing for me, she whispered to the empty room. She folded the letter carefully. They are mistaken. Outside, unseen eyes watched the house, unaware that the woman inside had already stepped beyond their control. Part 4, English, approximate. 1,500 words, story only. The invitation lay on Eleanor's dressing table like a challenge issued in ink and wax. She read it again by the light of a single candle, her expression calm despite the tension coiling beneath it. The dinner was to be held at Blackthorn Manor, a place known less for its elegance than for the power gathered within its walls. Decisions were made there, quietly, irrevocably. By morning, the household buzzed with restrained excitement. Aunt Margaret oversaw preparations with renewed purpose, issuing instructions with crisp efficiency. Dresses were selected, gloves inspected, carriage arrangements finalized. Eleanor submitted outwardly, allowing herself to be fitted and adjusted like a figure in a display, all the while measuring every word spoken around her. Tonight is important, Aunt Margaret said as Eleanor's hair was arranged. You must be attentive. I always am, Eleanor replied. Her aunt smiled thinly. This is different. Yes, Eleanor agreed. It is. The carriage ride to Blackthorn Manor was silent. Eleanor watched the countryside pass, familiar roads now feeling like borders between the life she had known and the one unfolding before her. She wondered briefly if Julian would be watching, somewhere unseen, as he always seemed to be when she needed him most. Blackthorn Manor rose from the landscape like a monument to authority. Dark stone, tall windows, iron gates that closed with ominous finality behind them. As Eleanor stepped inside, she felt the weight of countless unspoken agreements embedded in its walls. The dining hall was already filled with conversation when they entered. Men turned to look at her, their gazes polite yet calculating. Eleanor recognized several from previous visits, their interest now sharpened by purpose. Introductions were made, compliments exchanged. Eleanor smiled, listened, responded with measured grace. She could feel herself being tested, not for intelligence, but for pliability. Dinner progressed slowly, each course an exercise in restraint. Eleanor noticed how questions circled her without ever landing directly, how remarks were framed to provoke agreement rather than debate. You must find it comforting, one gentleman remarked, to know your family is so well supported. I find it reassuring to know the truth, Eleanor replied evenly. A flicker of surprise crossed his face before he recovered. Truth can be flexible. So can loyalty, Eleanor said. Across the table, a man with sharp features and colder eyes watched her intently. When he finally spoke, the room seemed to quiet instinctively. Miss Hartley, he said, you are admired for your composure. Thank you, Eleanor replied. Many young women in your position would be overwhelmed. I prefer to be informed, she said. The man smiled faintly. An admirable preference, though information often comes with expectations. Eleanor met his gaze without flinching. Expectations should be mutual. A brief silence followed. Aunt Margaret shifted beside her, But Eleanor did not look away. Later, as guests dispersed into smaller groups, Eleanor excused herself under the guise of fresh air. She stepped onto the terrace, the night cool against her skin. The garden beyond was dimly lit, shadows stretching long and indistinct. "You are playing a dangerous game," a voice said behind her. She turned to find a sharp-featured man, standing a short distance away. "I am attending a dinner," she replied calmly. He chuckled softly. "You are challenging assumptions." "Assumptions invite challenge," Eleanor said. He stepped closer. "Careful. Not everyone appreciates defiance. Nor should everyone expect submission," she replied. For a moment, his gaze hardened. "You are valuable, Miss Hartley. That is a position best handled with discretion." Eleanor folded her hands in front of her. "I intend to handle it myself." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Independence is admirable, until it becomes inconvenient." Before Eleanor could respond, another voice joined them. "Forgive the interruption." Julian emerged from the shadows, dressed impeccably, his presence instantly altering the balance of the exchange. Eleanor's heart skipped, though she kept her expression composed. "Mr. Ashford," the man said coolly, "I wasn't aware you were invited." "I rarely wait for invitations," Julian replied mildly. The tension between them was palpable. "I was enjoying a private conversation," the man said. Julian inclined his head. "Then allow me to improve it." The man's lips thinned. "Miss Hartley, perhaps we will continue this discussion another time." "I look forward to clarity," Eleanor said. When he left, Eleanor exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't be here." Julian smiled faintly. "Neither should you." She turned to face him fully. "You said to pretend." "And you are," he said. "Beautifully." She shook her head. "They are pressing harder." "They will," Julian replied. "Tonight was a test. Did I pass?" He studied her. "You disrupted expectations without revealing intent. That unsettles them." "That was not my aim," Eleanor said. "It should be," Julian replied. "Uncertainty is power." They walked slowly along the terrace, careful to remain visible yet unapproachable. "The man you spoke with," Julian continued, "is not accustomed to resistance." "I gathered that," Eleanor said. "He will push," Julian warned. "Soon." Eleanor's voice was steady. "Then I must be ready." Julian stopped and looked at her. "Are you frightened?" She considered the question. "Yes," she said honestly, "but not enough to surrender." A hint of approval crossed his face. "Good." As the evening drew to a close, Eleanor returned inside, her composure intact. The drive home was quieter than the journey there. Aunt Margaret deep in thought. "You were impressive tonight," her aunt said at last. "Was I?" Eleanor replied. "Yes," Aunt Margaret said. "You made them listen." Eleanor looked out the window. That was the point. That night, sleep came fitfully. Eleanor dreamed of doors opening and closing, of roads splitting in opposite directions. When she woke before dawn, resolve settled over her like armor. The next morning brought another letter. Not an invitation, a summons. Eleanor read it once, then twice. A private meeting. No excuses accepted. She folded the letter carefully, her pulse steady. This was escalation. And yet, she felt no urge to retreat. Instead, she reached for her cloak. Outside, the road waited, quiet, watchful, familiar. Somewhere along it, Julian would be moving as well, anticipating the same crossroads. Eleanor stepped forward, no longer merely reacting to the designs laid before her. She was choosing. The summons arrived without ceremony, its message stark and unmistakable. Eleanor held the letter between her fingers, as though it might burn her skin if she grasped it too tightly. A private meeting, a specific hour, a location chosen not for convenience, but for control. Aunt Margaret read it in silence, her face composed yet pale. "They are moving faster than I anticipated," she said at last. "So am I," Eleanor replied. Her aunt looked up sharply. "This is not the moment for defiance." "This is precisely the moment," Eleanor said quietly. Aunt Margaret rose and crossed the room, placing the letter on the table as if setting down a weapon. "You must understand what is at stake." "I do," Eleanor replied. "That is why I will not attend alone." A flicker of alarm crossed her aunt's face. You will not bring an escort. That would be seen as provocation. Then they should not provoke me, Eleanor said. The carriage was arranged for midday. Eleanor dressed plainly once more, her movements deliberate and calm. Beneath the composure, her thoughts moved swiftly, aligning plans with contingencies. Julian had warned her this moment would come. She had not known how soon. As the carriage rolled through the city streets, Eleanor watched faces pass by. Merchants, laborers, families, each absorbed in lives untouched by the quiet negotiations that could destroy her own. The injustice of it tightened her chest, then hardened into resolve. The meeting place was an office tucked behind an unremarkable facade. Inside, the air smelled faintly of ink and old paper. A single man waited for her, seated behind a heavy desk. "You are punctual," he said. "I respect my time," Eleanor replied. "And I expect the same." He gestured for her to sit. "Then let us not waste it." The discussion began politely enough. Formalities, reassurances, veiled compliments. Eleanor listened, responded, withheld. She recognized the rhythm now, the way questions were shaped to corner without appearing to do so. "You understand why this arrangement benefits everyone," the man said eventually. "I understand why it benefits you," Eleanor replied. His smile tightened. "And your family." "At my expense," she said. He leaned forward slightly. "Sacrifice is rarely evenly distributed." Eleanor met his gaze. "Then perhaps you should reconsider asking for it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You overestimate your position," he said. "On the contrary," Eleanor replied, "I am only beginning to understand it." The man exhaled slowly. "You have been influenced." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I have been informed. That distinction will not protect you," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed, "but it will guide me." When the meeting ended, there were no raised voices, no overt threats. Yet Eleanor left with the certainty that the game had changed. She was no longer a passive piece on the board. She was a variable. Outside, the street felt brighter, louder. Eleanor drew a steady breath and turned toward the carriage, only to find Julian waiting a short distance away, his posture relaxed, his eyes alert. "You were followed," he said quietly as she approached. "I expected as much," Eleanor replied. They did not walk together. They moved separately at first, crossing paths only after several turns, blending into the rhythm of the city until pursuit thinned and vanished. In a quiet alley, Julian finally spoke. "They pushed." "Yes," Eleanor said, "and they will push again." Julian studied her. "You held your ground." "I did more than that," she said. "I shifted it." A hint of approval flickered across his face. "Good. That will make them cautious." "And dangerous," Eleanor added. "Yes," Julian said. "Both." They walked on, the city unfolding around them. "There is something else," Julian said after a moment. "Your aunt. What about her?" Eleanor asked. "She's afraid," he said. "Not of them. Of losing control." Eleanor nodded slowly. "She believes fear is protection." "Fear is leverage," Julian replied. "Used properly, it can be turned." Eleanor stopped walking. "You keep speaking of turning forces of strategy. But what is the end?" Julian met her gaze. "Freedom." She searched his face. "For whom?" "For you," he said, "and perhaps for others who have never been given the option." The sincerity in his voice unsettled her more than any threat. "Why does that matter to you?" she asked again. Julian looked away briefly. "Because I once watched someone surrender their future believing it was necessary." Eleanor waited. "They were told it would protect their family," he continued. It did not. She felt the weight of his words settle between them. "And you cannot stop it." "No," he said, "but I can stop this." They resumed walking. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, the city shifting subtly toward evening. Eleanor felt the distance between herself and the life she had known widening with every step. At Hartley House, Aunt Margaret was waiting. "They contacted me," her aunt said without preamble. "I know," Eleanor replied. "They are displeased," Aunt Margaret continued. "You embarrassed them." "I refused them," Eleanor said. "That is worse," her aunt snapped. "You do not refuse men like that." Eleanor's voice remained calm. "I do." Aunt Margaret stared at her. seeing perhaps for the first time not a niece to be managed, but a woman who would not bend. You are putting us all at risk. I'm ending the risk, Eleanor replied. There is a difference. Her aunt shook her head slowly. You are naive. Eleanor stepped closer. I am aware. Silence stretched, heavy and unresolved. That night, Eleanor wrote letters. Careful, deliberate communications that asked questions without appearing to do so, that reopened connections long neglected. Julian had taught her the importance of networks. Influence did not exist in isolation. Days passed. Tension mounted. Invitations ceased. Messages arrived instead, indirect, probing, increasingly impatient. And then a warning. A servant whispered of unfamiliar men near the gates. A package arrived unmarked, its contents unsettling in their specificity. Julian appeared again at dusk, his expression grave. They are applying pressure. Good, Eleanor said. They believe I will yield. And will you? He asked. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. No. He nodded once. Then it is time. Time for what? She asked. For them to realize, Julian said, that you are not alone. Eleanor's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with anticipation. The path ahead was uncertain, dangerous, irreversible. Yet for the first time, it felt like hers.